Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-jung Cho. North Korea has reiterated the year-end deadline for the U.S. to reconsider its approach after the latest round of working-level talks ended unsuccessfully. North Korea also rejected U.S. suggestion that the talks resume 2 weeks later. So what happens next?
기대감을 한껏 부풀게 하였으나 아무것도 들고 나오지 않았으며 우리를 크게 실망시키고 협상 의욕을 떨어뜨렸습니다.
I think the talks that were just held in Stockholm were important, and we're hopeful that the DPRK will want to continue in that way.
In the studio with me today, Mr. Frank Jannuzi, president of the Mansfield Foundation and former advisor to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Also joining me, Mr. Scott Snyder, director of U.S.-Korea Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. His latest book, South Korea at the Crossroads, charts the evolution of South Korean foreign policy and strategic choices. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Now, Frank, after the breakdown of the Sweden working-level talks, U.S. accepted Sweden's offer to come back to the talks in 2 weeks, whereas North Korea didn't. Why do you think the United States is eager to come back to the table?
I think it's pretty clear that the U.S. negotiating team has instructions from President Trump to make as much progress as possible, as quickly as possible. And while the North Koreans seem to be more reluctant, wanting the United States to perhaps soften its negotiating position, I think the American side is really eager to establish a pattern of working-level talks that can be consistent and sustained to lay the groundwork for a successful third summit. So for the moment, the U.S. is the more eager of the two partners.
Mm-hmm. And Scott, the breakdown of the Sweden working-level talks, do you think North Korea premeditated this? Was this a revenge to the United States?
Well, I did think in retrospect that Vice Minister Choi Sun-hee made a very interesting statement in anticipation of the talks, saying that the talks would occur for 1 day in Sweden. And I think that in a way it played out exactly as she projected. She indicated that there would be 1 day of talks, and she did not indicate the possibility of extending those talks, and in fact that's what we saw.
Mm-hmm. So, Frank, are we now in for a complete termination of talks between U.S. and North Korea, or do you anticipate talks to resume sometime soon?
Well, I hope they will resume, but I think that we are in a position right now where the North Koreans have basically signaled to the U.S. side, we're not very interested in talking with you until you first reciprocate the measures that the North has already taken. Now, of course, the U.S. side might quibble with whether those steps deserve additional reciprocation, but clearly the North Koreans are looking for some sanctions relief. They're looking for some further reduction in the American ROK joint military exercises and military posture. All of this to sort of sweeten the negotiating atmosphere prior to the resumption of these working level talks. So we're definitely in a pause period where the U.S. side is going to have to assess what, if anything, they're prepared to put on the table to convince the North Koreans to resume serious talks.
Mm-hmm. So just like what Frank just mentioned, North Korea is demanding the United States to reciprocate to its what it calls confidence-building measures, and also ask the United States to stop the hostile policy on North Korea. So compared to North Korea's position at the Hanoi summit, where North Korea offered to denuclearize Yongbyon facility, do you think North Korea has hardened its negotiation position?
I do see North Korea as reverting to their previous talking points with regard to what it would take to move forward. And that may represent a little bit of a battening down of the hatches in North Korea in terms of their approach. It actually raises the question of whether whatever window of opportunity that might have been open might have started to close. But I also think that the North Koreans are going to look very hard at the information that they received in Stockholm, and that whether or not they come back to talks will probably be dependent on how they interpret the opportunity to move forward.
There may also be an opportunity for President Trump to weigh in personally, as he has in the past, with personal messages to shape the way that the North Koreans perceive the Swedish talks.
So on that point, North Korea, during that Swedish talks, rejected U.S. offer for consecutive and intensive negotiations. What is telling about this?
Well, I think it does show the North Korean preference that Scott was even alluding to, the old style that they have enjoyed with President Trump of really going right to the top. That they believe that President Trump is the person who can unlock the more conciliatory American approach. And so it may be that their reluctance to enter into the serious, sustained, working-level talks is because they believe that the U.S. negotiating team will strike a harder bargain than the president might. So perhaps they're holding back in the hopes of bringing Trump to that third summit.
Yeah, I agree very much with Frank on this. I think that the North Korean strategy has always been to try to engage with President Trump at the perceived moment of greatest political need in order to get a concession that they might not otherwise be able to get. And so I think that's the reason why they waited all summer in order to try to engage right now. And of course, from their perspective, they've already sent the signal that the window would close at the beginning of next year, which makes a lot of sense as our focus turns to the domestic scene and to the presidential election.
So I want both your opinions. So the talks keep on falling apart, breaking down. Is there a fundamental problem with the 4-point Singapore agreement?
That's an interesting question. I think that there may be a problem with the interpretation of the agreement. I think that the main issues of peace and denuclearization have been put out there, but the North Koreans like to view it as being implemented in a sequential fashion. But Special Representative Began, I think, indicated at the very beginning of the process that we prefer to look at it in simultaneous and parallel terms. And so, in some ways, that's where I think that the misconnect has existed to the extent that the Singapore Declaration is implementable.
I agree with Scott, and I also think it's a very important question you ask. I think the two parties have not really defined the end goal. There is the broad agreement on denuclearization and peace, but the terms of denuclearization are not specified. Can the North have a civilian nuclear program, for instance? And on the peace, the mechanism is not specified. Must there be a peace treaty? Could there be some other kind of a peace regime established on the peninsula? And until they nail down those end goals, it's hard to have working level talks to work out the step-by-step or parallel processes to reach the goal. And they really haven't nailed down the objectives yet.
Yeah, so as Frank just mentioned, there are growing calls, as talks hit a snag, there are growing calls for the Trump administration to turn to a more phased approach. And the former U.S. negotiator, Ambassador Joe DeTrani, says if there is wavering on the part of the need for complete denuclearization, then this would encourage North Korea to think that U.S. may allow North Korea to keep some of its nuclear weapons. So which do you agree with more?
Well, my own feeling is that Special Representative Began has probably made the maximum step that the U.S. could make in order to try to combine those approaches. We still need agreement on the destination and knowledge that North Korea is committed to complete denuclearization, but it's not all going to happen in one day. In fact, it's probably going to be a long process, and I believe that that may have been reflected in the U.S. position in Stockholm.
And Frank, North Korea threatened that its moratorium on ICBM testing and nuclear testing is totally dependent on the United States. Do you think North Korea may take that decision to restart ICBM testing?
I think it's unlikely that North Korea would essentially give the United States an excuse to resume a maximum pressure style campaign of sanctions against the North. Kim Jong-un has spoken repeatedly about the importance of economic modernization and economic progress for the North Korean people. And I expect that his New Year's address in 2020 will also very much be focused on those economic goals. So while the North will always reserve the right to return to the more provocative posture that they had in 2016 and 2017, I think there are many reasons for them to hold those threats in abeyance, including the likely response of China, which would be quite hostile to any North Korean resumption, especially of nuclear weapons testing. So I don't want to say that it's empty rhetoric on the part of the North, but I believe that there are a wide range of retaliatory measures they could introduce in the new year to demonstrate their displeasure. But ICBM testing and nuclear testing, I think, would be unlikely.
Let me just say that I think that North Korea is really struggling to find elements of coercion designed to send the signal to the U.S. that time is not on its side. I think that we've seen this for some time. They're trying to signal that they still have those measures at their disposal. But it is true that really the bar, it's not necessarily President Trump, but it is the China-North Korea relationship. And what the North Koreans cannot afford to do, I think, is to take actions that turn the Chinese in a more negative direction toward North Korea.
And Frank, the chief North Korea's negotiator, Kim Myung-gil, you worked with him while he was at the North Korean mission at the United Nations. So was he the kind of character to walk out of the meeting and make angry statements?
Well, you know, I did have many interactions with him when he was in New York, principally dealing with the arrest of American citizens and attempting to secure their release. I found Kim Myung-gil to be a rather dispassionate person, all business, very serious, but a reliable interlocutor in that he never overstepped the instructions that he had been given, and he spoke within his authority. And so when I was dealing with him, I always felt that I could trust that what he was saying was truthful. Now, the reports of his sort of emotional outburst, the North Koreans are pretty good at the drama stage. So it wouldn't surprise me that occasionally they would bang the table or express their displeasure that way. That's part of diplomacy. Americans are not typically as good at it as the North Koreans are, but occasionally we have to remind ourselves not to take it too seriously.
And you saw firsthand that he was groomed to be a nuclear negotiator.
Yeah, when I first met him in the early 1990s, he was part of the Institute of Disarmament and Peace team that was really being prepared for engagement with the United States. Mm-hmm. And we subsequently saw that small team has been very durable in the 1990s and 2000s, and now even today, with Ambassador Kim leading those negotiations.
Mm-hmm. And Frank, European countries, 6 of them, condemned North Korea for launching the submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and North Korea blamed United States for being behind this movement. So why is North Korea blaming the United States for the legit concerns by the European countries?
Well, it's a very interesting question about how this was orchestrated in New York, and we don't know all the details. It may well be that the United States chose to take a kind of a backstage role and allow some of our European friends and allies to play the heavy in complaining about these North Korean launches, which are a violation of the UN Security Council resolutions. I think the North Koreans don't want to let America play that game. They want us always to know that anything the international community does, whether it's a sanction imposed by South Korea or one by Japan or the UN Security Council, they're going to attribute that to Washington's orchestration of the pressure campaign against them. This is part of their attempts to focus on the U.S., the sole responsibility for the hostile policy that they find themselves under. And it's also part of their way of deflecting any personal responsibility.
And Scott, Russia's foreign ministry announced that Russia's deputy foreign minister and Special Representative Began held a telephone conversation upon the request of the United States. So why do you think the U.S. is reaching out to Russia at this point?
Well, I think that it's part of the debrief that had occurred earlier in the week, first with our allies, South Korea and Japan, and then it's natural to reach out to the other partners, Russia, and actually what is really striking is that we haven't seen public mention of a direct dialogue with China on this issue. And yet China is obviously a key background player, and we need to see Special Representative Began engaging with his Chinese counterpart. And so the absence of that dialogue is quite worrisome in the context of the broader disputes in China-U.S. relations over trade and other issues.
Before we go, I want both your opinions. So North Korea is trying hard to create the image of putting the ball in United States court. So how should United States strategize from here on?
Well, John Kerry used to say about the North Korean situation that everyone likes to argue about, whose court the ball is in, and that often the ball is stuck in the net and someone has to go get it. And I think right now we are in one of these situations where both sides are looking to the other to make the first diplomatic concession. The U.S. is the stronger power. We should seize the initiative. We should put offers on the table that compel North Korea to respond. Whether those offers are inducements or a new round of pressure and sanction, I can't say, but it really is incumbent upon the United States, if they want to see a change in North Korea's behavior, for the United States to seize the initiative.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I would say that we need to engage diplomatically in that way, but it's precisely the instrument of compulsion that I think is now missing in terms of the environment for negotiations. I don't think that North Korea is feeling the pressure because of the improved relationship with China. And that's the primary reason why I think that there's a possibility that for now the window for productive dialogue is closing.
Well, we'll have to leave it there and now watch video for our next discussion.
米朝首脳会談に今朝、北朝鮮が2発の弾道ミサイルを発射いたしました。厳重に抗議し、強く非難します。
日本海の経済水域内におきまして、北朝鮮漁船と思われる船と水産庁取締船。
Prime Minister Abe has offered to hold a summit with Chairman Kim without preconditions. But recently, a North Korean missile landed in Japanese waters and North Korean fishing trawler collided with a Japanese patrol ship. So, Scott, the latest developments in the Japanese exclusive economic zone, would this lead to increased tension between Pyongyang and Tokyo?
It's bound to increase Japanese concerns about renewed missile testing. And the relationship is already at a pretty low point. So I do think that for Japan, this is a problem because it represents a potential direct threat. It's easy to imagine how a North Korean missile test that goes into Japan's EEZ could go wrong and possibly even land on Japanese territory.
So, Frank, Japan held a PAC-3 drill for the first time in 6 years. Do you think the submarine-launched ballistic missile startled Japan? How is President Trump dismissing North Korea's missile launches? How is this being received in Japan?
I hope to hear more directly from Japanese officials about their response. I do think the PAC-3 test was the government of Japan demonstrating to the Japanese people that they have ways to respond to the North Korean ballistic missile threat. And I believe that it was a direct response, likely, to that SLBM test. As Scott pointed out, that SLBM threat is real. And the missile had sufficient range to have overflown Japan territory if it had flown on a different trajectory. So it was a threat aimed directly at Japan by North Korea, demonstrating capabilities that Japan is very concerned about. And when President Trump dismisses shorter range missile tests, whether they are land tests or SLBM tests, it does cause a great anxiety in Tokyo because they really want to ensure that Japan's equities are not ignored in the process of the peace and denuclearization talks that are underway. So I imagine there was a sternly worded phone call from someone in the Japanese Gaimasho to the State Department saying, could you please remind your president that we are not ignoring these short-range tests, and neither should you.
Well, I think this is the area where we have seen the greatest evidence of public disagreement between President Trump and Prime Minister Abe. It's been quite striking. It's happened twice. And otherwise, I think there's been great effort by both leaders to really minimize disagreement. And so this really stands out as a fissure. And it's pretty clear that the North Koreans are interested in trying to expand that fissure.
And Prime Minister Abe has been asking for a summit with Chairman Kim several times. And do you think Prime Minister Abe's continued courting to North Korea would improve the relationship?
Well, it depends on Kim Jong-un, but I think that the really interesting question is whether or not Tokyo can find a way to use the hosting of the Olympics in a similar fashion to the way that South Korea was able to use the hosting of the Winter Olympics as a means by which to change the trajectory of the Japan-North Korea relationship. This will require creativity and skill, and it'll be interesting to see whether the Japanese Foreign Ministry is up to that approach.
It's a really good point. You know, the Prime Minister of South Korea will travel to Tokyo next week for the enthronement ceremony of the new Japanese emperor. And the Olympics in 2020 looms as this very important diplomatic opportunity for Japan, not only to signify its reemergence in the region as a major player politically, economically, militarily, but potentially to bring a unified Korean Peninsula athletic team from South Korea and North Korea to Tokyo and use it as an opportunity to improve relations. I will point out there's also the threat that things could go horribly wrong, and that if Japan-South Korea relations are not repaired sufficiently by next summer, you could see a unified Korean boycott of the 2020 Olympic Games, and really see that overshadow what Japan and Prime Minister Abe himself hope to be this wonderful celebration.
Wow, the unified Korean boycott could be on the extreme end of the circumstances. There's a concern on Japan and South Korea relations, yet the chief nuclear negotiators met in Washington right after the breakdown of the Swedish working level talks. So is this a sign that even though the difficulties in bilateral relations between Seoul and Tokyo, it will not hinder their cooperation on the North Korea issue?
Well, I think it's a sign that the magnitude of the threat from North Korea is sufficient to bring the three together, but it definitely does not signal a closing in that gap. North Korea has also provided a pretext for South Korea to change its position on the issue of GSOMIA renewal, because they have shown that they are a threat that requires intelligence coordination. So I actually think that this is a kind of opportunity for South Korea to get out of a difficult position on that issue.
We'll end our conversation here and now move on to our next segment. Now, time for the photo moment, time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today, we have a photo of the North Korean leader visiting a military farm soon after the breakdown of the working level talks. He urged the development of high-yield crops to solve the food problem. International organizations forecast this year's harvest in North Korea to fall below the previous 5 years. Scott, what's your reaction?
Well, I'm glad to see Kim Jong-un focusing on an economic issue instead of attending another missile test. And so I think that is progress. But the issue of the food situation, I think, will continue to be a challenge.
Frank?
Yes, it's a reminder of two things to me. One is that the military itself is not just engaged in military operations, but they're also a major economic arm of the country. But also, as Scott has pointed out, you know, Kim Jong-un's focus are meat and potato issues, if you will, or in this case, maybe corn and rice and kimchi issues. And those are what are most important to the North Korean people as well for the coming year.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Scott, Frank, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Eun-jung.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eun-jung Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.